In Episode 8, titled ROE Deep Dive, we're going to treat rules of engagement as what they really are, the playbook that keeps technical skill aligned with safety, permission, and professional responsibility. When people struggle with Pen Test Plus scenario questions, it's often because they spot a tempting technical move and forget that the exam is grading judgment inside boundaries, not raw capability. ROE is the set of rails that makes your actions defensible, repeatable, and appropriate for the environment you've been trusted to assess. It also gives you a clean answer to what do I do next when the scenario is messy, because the next step must always be legal, authorized, and safe. The goal here is to make ROE feel like an operational tool you can apply quickly, not like paperwork you tolerate.
Approved techniques and prohibited techniques are the first major ROE lever, and the exam expects you to treat them as hard constraints, not suggestions. Approved techniques define the kinds of actions you are allowed to take to discover, validate, and demonstrate issues, while prohibited techniques define what cannot be done, even if it would work perfectly. Those boundaries exist because clients have risk tolerance, operational realities, and legal obligations, and a test that ignores those realities becomes a liability rather than a service. A common exam trap is an option that looks effective but implicitly crosses a prohibited line, often by being overly disruptive or by expanding beyond what was authorized. When you see technique boundaries in a prompt, the correct answer is usually the one that accomplishes the objective using permitted methods, rather than the one that is fastest in a vacuum. Timing rules are the second major lever, and they change best answers more often than people expect. Maintenance windows, business hours, and blackout periods are not just scheduling details. They are risk controls that define when certain activities are acceptable or unacceptable. A disruptive technique might be permissible during a maintenance window, but unacceptable during business hours, even if the objective is the same. Blackout periods are especially important because they signal do not introduce uncertainty, meaning even moderately risky actions can be wrong because they can create operational confusion or unplanned downtime. Exam prompts often include timing cues briefly, and the point is to treat those cues as decision drivers, not as background flavor. If two options could work, the one that respects timing rules and reduces operational risk is usually the one that fits our OEE maturity. Escalation paths are where our OE turns into real-world coordination, and the exam uses them to test whether you think like a professional partner rather than a lone operator. Escalation defines who to notify, through what channel, and under what conditions, especially when you encounter unexpected exposure, instability, or high-risk conditions. Knowing who to contact matters, but knowing when urgency matters is even more important, because some events require immediate notification rather than waiting for a report later. In scenario questions, escalation often appears as an option that pauses and communicates versus an option that continues silently, and the correct choice typically favors controlled communication when risk increases. Good escalation protects the client by giving them the chance to make operational decisions in real time, and it protects you by keeping your actions within agreed governance. When you treat escalation as part of the playbook, you stop seeing it as slowing down and start seeing it as staying authorized. Stop conditions are a close cousin of escalation paths, and they are the clearest signal that our OE is built to prevent harm. Instability is a stop condition because continuing in an unstable environment can turn a controlled test into an uncontrolled incident. Unexpected data exposure is a stop condition because it can trigger confidentiality risks, legal issues, and ethical obligations that must be handled deliberately. Safety risk is always a stop condition, full stop, because the moment safety is in question, the mission becomes harm reduction and communication, not progress. A client request is also a stop condition
because authorization is conditional, and the client can narrow, pause, or halt activity at any time for operational reasons. In exam terms, options that press forward despite stop condition cues are often wrong because they demonstrate poor governance instincts and weak professional judgment.
Another useful ROE layer is how it frames permitted tooling categories in plain terms, because the exam cares more about outcomes than about tool trivia. Discovery tools are those that help you learn what exists and what is reachable, usually with lower impact and higher emphasis on mapping. Validation tools help you confirm whether a suspected weakness is real and relevant, ideally with controlled, low-risk proof that avoids unnecessary disruption. Proof-oriented tooling supports controlled demonstration of impact when the objective calls for it, but it still remains bound by safety, permission, and timing rules. The main mistake is treating proof as the default mode when the environment or objective calls for discovery or validation, because that often violates the spirit of ROE, even if it is technically possible. When you map tools to ROE permitted outcomes, you pick options that fit both the phase and the governance of the engagement.
Client-provided credentials introduce a special set of limits that are OEE often spells out, and exam questions like to probe whether you understand those limits without needing a lecture. Credentials provided by clients are a form of authorization to access specific systems in specific ways, not a blank check to roam wherever those credentials might technically work. Their use is typically constrained by scope, objective, and minimum necessary access, meaning you use them to prove the point you were asked to prove, not to explore unrelated assets. There may also be limits on how credentials are stored, shared among team members, or used across environments, because credential handling is itself a security risk. In many prompts, the right move is to use credentials in a controlled way that supports validation or proof while documenting what was accessed and why. If an answer choice treats client credentials as a shortcut to expand scope, it often reveals a governance failure that the exam is designed to catch. Data handling rules are the quiet backbone of ROE, because a penetration test can create sensitive artifacts even when the testing itself is careful. Storage rules define where evidence can live and how it must be protected. Retention rules define how long it can be kept, and sharing rules define who can see it and under what conditions. Minimum collection is a guiding principle that shows up across all three, because collecting more than necessary increases risk without improving the credibility of a finding. The exam often rewards answers that capture enough evidence to support reporting while explicitly avoiding bulk collection of sensitive data, especially when prompts mention confidentiality or regulated environments. A professional tester collects proof, not trophies, and ROEE exists to keep that distinction clear. When you think about data handling as part of the playbook, you naturally prefer options that reduce exposure while still supporting defensible conclusions. It's also worth internalizing that many actions can cause outages, even when they are technically possible, and the exam wants you to respect that reality. Some techniques create load, instability, or unexpected side effects, and an environment that looks stable on paper can still behave unpredictably under stress. ROE boundaries exist partly because clients cannot always tolerate the risk of disruption, especially when systems are customer-facing or tied to mission-critical operations. That is why technically effective is not the same as professionally acceptable, and why answers that cause avoidable risk are often wrong in scenario contexts. The best option is frequently the one that advances the objective while minimizing disruption, even if it feels less satisfying than a more aggressive move. When a prompt emphasizes production sensitivity or business continuity, treat that as a loud signal to favor low-impact, controlled approaches. Now consider a scenario where priorities conflict, because that's where our OE thinking becomes the deciding factor rather than just a nice principle. Imagine you are under time pressure to produce results. The client wants speed, and you also see a path that could prove impact quickly, but the rules restrict disruptive methods during business hours and require escalation for certain findings. At the same time, you discover something that looks serious, and the temptation is to press forward to deliver value before the window closes. This is the moment where speed versus safety versus permission must be reconciled, and ROE is the reconciliation mechanism. Exam options in these scenarios often include one choice that accelerates progress by ignoring constraints, one that freezes completely without purpose, and one that continues in a compliant, controlled way with appropriate communication. The correct choice typically reflects controlled progress within rules, because the exam is measuring whether you can deliver outcomes without breaking trust.
The decision process that resolves those conflicts should be simple and repeatable, because complexity creates excuses for bad judgment. First, confirm what the rules allow right now, including timing and prohibited techniques, because an action that violates those rules is not a viable option, regardless of how attractive it looks. Next, check whether the action requires assumptions about permission or scope, and if it does, treat it as an escalation decision rather than an execution decision. Then choose the safest forward-moving action that still supports the objective, such as a low-impact validation step or a documentation-first approach that preserves evidence and reduces uncertainty.
Finally, communicate through the established path when the risk profile changes, because ROE often expects real-time coordination for high-impact discoveries or operational concerns.
When you follow this process, compliance wins over curiosity every time, not because curiosity is bad, but because ungoverned curiosity is how engagements go sideways.
A memory phrase can keep that process available under pressure, especially when the prompt is dense and the answer choices are tempting. You want the phrase to reinforce timing, methods, escalation, and stop rules, because those four elements are where most boundary mistakes happen. Think in terms of time, technique, tell, terminate, where you first check whether the timing allows the action, then confirm the technique is permitted, then decide who must be told based on escalation paths, and then recognize whether any stop conditions require you to pause or halt. The purpose of a phrase like this is not to be clever. It is to make boundary checks automatic before you commit to an answer. When a question feels confusing, it often means you are missing a boundary cue, and the memory phrase forces you to look for it. Once the boundary is visible, the correct option usually stands out because it is the only one that fits the playbook. The practical takeaway is that ROE changes what you do next by redefining what best means in the scenario, and it does so in a consistent way. It narrows the set of valid actions to those that are authorized, safe, and aligned with timing and method constraints, which removes many technically plausible but professionally wrong choices. It also changes the decision flow by requiring escalation or stopping when certain triggers appear, meaning progress is sometimes a communication action rather than a technical action. When you treat ROE as the playbook, you stop chasing the most aggressive option and start selecting the most defensible option that moves the objective forward. That mindset aligns directly with how Pen Test Plus questions are written, because they reward disciplined sequencing under constraints. If you can quickly ask, "What does ROE permit right now?" you will eliminate many wrong answers before you even compare technical details.
The essentials to carry forward are straightforward. Know what techniques are approved or prohibited, respect timing rules, follow escalation paths, recognize stop conditions, and handle credentials and data with minimum necessary discipline. Permitted tooling can be understood as outcomes discovery, validation, proof chosen to match objectives and constraints rather than impulse. When speed, safety, and permission conflict, The right decision is the one that stays compliant while continuing in a controlled, communicative way. Now mentally apply those essentials to one scenario you've seen before by placing yourself at the moment of decision, checking timing, confirming the method is allowed, deciding whether escalation is required, and pausing if any stop condition is present. If you can rehearse that boundary check once, you have the exact muscle memory the exam is trying to measure. With that habit in place, the workflow becomes not only more professional, but also easier to answer correctly under time pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.